after the Rochelle Bond sentencing hearing. As we know, Rochelle Bond pled guilty to accessory after the fact and larceny over $250. She has been sentenced to 2 years probation. She's going into a drug rehabilitation facility directly from jail at her defense attorney's request. We just heard from the district attorney, Dan Conley, the press asking him a lot of questions about the decision to give Rochelle Bond this, what everybody's qualifying as a sweetheart deal, in exchange for her testimony against Michael McCarthy, who was ultimately convicted of the killing of 2-year-old Bella Bond. I'm here with Ken Belkin. We were watching this press conference with bated breath. We were listening to DA Conley. Couple of points. I mean, there's a lot to go through because I think the press actually went pretty easy on him. They asked some questions, they pressed a little, but they didn't quite go in for the, those real meaty questions. One thing that I noticed when the press was asking questions, the community is not over this. The community is not really believing Rochelle Bond.
Nor should the community be over this. I mean, a child was murdered, and there's a lot of evidence that points that the wrong person got convicted here. Look, I know DA Connolly was carefully, and not to offend our Boston viewers, evaluating the evidence.
I don't think it's offensive, Ken. That's pretty good.
Thank you. I work on it in front of the mirror every day. But he was carefully considering the evidence. But I think what it comes down to is he needed, and he said, there was no case without her testimony. He needed someone's testimony, something to link to this horrific act. And there was no DNA evidence that could really do it. There was no other witnesses. It was going to be one of these two people, the terrible mother who's a junkie, or the terrible boyfriend who's a junkie and believes in the demon Gamesh or whatever it is he believes in. And I think they probably put it to them to see who would come and flip and tell more. And clearly she did.
You brought up something that really struck a chord with me, and I'm going to read the quote directly. This is what the DA, Dan Conley, said. There would have been no prosecution without the testimony of Rochelle Bond.
Yeah, there was not enough evidence to tie him to these horrific allegations without her coming forward.
And that's it. So, Ken, isn't it true? I mean, somebody, obviously, even by her own testimony during the trial and her own account of the story, she's involved. This could have been a co-conspirator. They could have been charged together. Absolutely. So in the end, they knew, because they did not have that physical evidence or forensic evidence that they might have needed, that they pressed on, maybe both, we don't know what happens behind closed doors, to see who would be the one to testify against the other. In the end, we have Rochelle Bond. But when DA Conley was talking about the decision of the district attorney's office to offer this deal in exchange for the testimony, he said, oh, she had a very believable story. I mean, I never met her, but her story was very, very believable, sympathetic, blah, blah, blah. What do you make of that?
I'm sure a lot of the voting public may not agree with that statement, and he may see that in the next election. But look, if I was a reporter in that room, I know Aaron Keller would have asked the hard questions.
I literally was just about to say, good thing Aaron Keller was not in that room, because he would have really pressed.
I'm sure. I would want to know. What exactly was that negotiation process with these defendants? What was offered to him? What was offered to her initially? How did they lean on them to get them to flip?
Exactly, and we don't know that information. What we know is what we saw come out during the trial. Now, we saw her testimony. I mean, days and days of her testimony that we can't possibly rehash it now, but there's a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of back and forth, a lot of stories changing, and a lot of evidence that we found, internet posts, stuff like that, after Bella Bond's death, that really undercut the prosecution's theory of the case.
Yeah, but the problem is, if Michael McCarthy truly was not involved, when they leaned on him, what can he say but, I had nothing to do with this? That doesn't bolster the prosecution's case. But her flipping and telling her little sob story, that helps. It's very interesting how this turned out.
Right, and one thing we do know, that it's common in co-conspirator cases, right? When you've got two co-defendants in a case, especially a murder case, that's a common tactic, correct? I mean, a lot of times people are pointing the finger at each other. A lot of times the DA offers a deal to one to testify against the other. I mean, that's not uncommon.
Yeah.
Why is this case striking a chord? Why is everybody so infuriated in this case?
Well, this is a child. I mean, the murder of a child is one of the more egregious crimes that we bear witness to in society.
It really is. And when you see those pictures of Bella Bond flash across the screen during the trial, I mean, it was heartbreaking. And it was difficult to hear Rochelle Bond on the stand telling her story and thinking, I don't know, she's pretty involved in this case. And we opined here at this table about how that would impact the actual prosecution. Could Michael McCarthy be convicted when there's this alternate theory that it was actually Rochelle Bond who was the culprit? So interesting, the case turned out, I mean, we got a guilty verdict. It was put before a jury. A jury decided about the credibility of Rochelle Bond, and they made that determination to convict.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see how they gave her that much credibility. This woman, criminal convictions up the wazoo, history of prostitution, drug abuse, clearly not Mother of the Year. You know, I don't know how they could give her the amount of credibility they did. And really, her evidence is what convicted. Her testimony is the evidence, primary evidence that convicted him.
So when the prosecution makes that determination, what are the factors that come into play? So as a prosecutor, you're sitting there and you've got these two people clearly involved in some capacity in the death of a 2-year-old child, and you've got two people who you could charge as co-defendants, as co-conspirators. How do you make that? What are those factors that you take into consideration to get there, to choose which witness you're going to put the pressure on?
I think they probably put significant amounts of pressure on both those witnesses. And I always say, you know, we see what happens publicly in the trial, in the hearings, the sentencing, the press conferences. I tell all my clients that are charged with criminal offenses that 90% of what's going to happen on your case is going to happen outside of the courtroom. So I'm very curious what that 90% is in this case, because it's probably very telling.
Right. There was definitely some in a closed room negotiations going on in this case, no question. You brought up an interesting point when we were discussing Rochelle Bond. So she has this history of criminal conduct.
Yeah.
Now she's on probation. We started to talk about this, then the press conference broke. What happens now? So she's on probation, 2 years. She has conditions to her probation. What if she violates one of those conditions?
Oh, I'd say the chances are pretty likely, given her history, that she's going to violate probation. And if she does violate, you know, I believe the judge would have the capability to sentence her to up to the maximum on each of those charges, the accessory after the fact and the larceny.
So, I mean, you're talking about a much different deal than she has right now.
She could still go to jail if she comes back. Look, they might not violate her the first time she comes back and fails a drug test, but repeated failures of drug tests, maybe not checking in with her probation officer, maybe a routine home inspection that brings something to the fore that's untoward, you know, that could land her back in front of the judge, and he's not going to be that happy with seeing her again.
Oh, definitely not, especially given the fact that she's really been given a reprieve here. I mean, 2 years probation is not so bad, given the circumstances of this case, that she could have been charged as a co-conspirator, she could have been a co-defendant in the case. And so the judge does not want to see her crossing his path, I'm sure.
They could have been co-defendants, but the problem is they needed the testimony of one of them. So without it, they really wouldn't have had much.
So what do you think about the district attorney's response to some of these questions? I mean, this case has not been put to bed, despite the fact McCarthy has had, hey, a fair trial. A jury made a determination, right? And that's what happens. The jury is given the evidence, they hear the testimony, and they make a finding, a fact about the case. And here they felt there was enough evidence to convict him. The DA still seems to be answering a lot of questions about the decision to give Rochelle Bond this deal.
As he should. And I also think, interesting, we did say it's a fair trial, and but I'm not so sure. The judge, when he was instructing the jury in this matter, gave a very unique instruction where he said something to the effect that, look, just because you believe someone else may have been involved in the murder, it doesn't mean that Michael McCarthy is not guilty. And I do think, the defense strenuously objected when that instruction was being given, but I do think it was inappropriate for him to say that to the jury.
And will that be a subject of appeal in this particular case?
The defense attorney, I would say that's probably grounds for an appeal.
Yeah, you got to make sure to preserve those issues.
Yeah.
You'll probably be seeing that determination
And
appealed
look,
for sure.
this guy's going to jail for a very long time. He's got nothing but time on his hands and nothing to lose with appealing.
So another interesting thing that came up during the press conference, we heard from Rochelle Bond's attorney, and we heard a lot of questions about whether Bond is going to be trying to reconnect with family, with friends, with her other children. What was the focus of those questions? Is that because, you know, we're talking about somebody, the DA came out and said, we're hoping she becomes a productive member of society, she's going to rehab, blah, blah, blah. Is that the focus of those questions? Can she do it, given her history?
Look, I don't know, but if I were a betting man, I wouldn't be betting on Miss Mother of the Year to be winning any upstanding citizen awards.
Well, I guess we'll see. Also, in this case, is that unique? We're talking about somebody, she's got her probation deal, but she's opting to stay in jail for a little bit longer because she needs to find a place in a facility.
Well, as some jailbirds I've represented like to say, 3 hots and a cot. You know, she's got her meals and her bed taken care of for her. It might even be better than the homeless shelters that she was residing in.
Right. So now we see that she has these conditions to her probation. A lot of them focused on drug testing. What other stuff does she have to stay away from? One thing we heard, she has to not associate with people who are drug users. How do you judge that as a probation officer?
Look, probation is a very, very invasive process. You know, these probation officers pretty much have carte blanche to come into your home, talk to your friends, talk to your relatives at random times, anytime really. And, you know, they're looking to catch you. Depends on the probation officer. Some are, you know, a little bit more strict than others.
And so I guess we'll see. If she's in a rehabilitation facility, will those visits begin after that, after she's discharged?
The probation's probably going to start relatively soon.
Well, it's going to be interesting to continue to follow that aspect of the case. Going back to DA Dan Conley's statement, I do think it's very interesting that he came out and he said there is no prosecution without her testimony. Now, a lot of the questions from the media was focused on, is this justice? And is his response really, well, it's justice because somebody's paying for Bella Bond's murder? Is that what read between the lines? Is that what you're hearing?
Look, this mother, whether or not she committed the murder or not, clearly she was involved in some level, and she was abusive, and she endangered the welfare of her child. Is the public going to be satisfied by 2 years probation and some time served? I don't know. I guess they're going to have to take that up at the ballot box.
Yeah, definitely. I think we'll probably, the questions by the media leads us to believe. DA said, people come up to me on the street and ask this question all the time. That's interesting, an interesting factor.
If I were running for DA of Suffolk County, I think my campaign ads might be being made this week.
Very interesting. Ken Belkin, thanks for giving us some insight into how that process works and into the maybe not so surprising outcome of the Bella Bond case. Michael McCarthy, he was convicted, but a lot of people not letting Rochelle Bond off the hook, now serving 2 years probation. Very interesting case. We'll continue to follow any development.